Monday. John Lorden here with a new episode of Brain Scratch Case Cracked. Thank you so much for joining me on the channel here today. Before we get into today's case, I just want to give you guys a heads up. This one has a little more graphic description than we usually include for Case Cracked episodes, but it's a historically relevant case, and you really need to understand the details to understand the sentencing in particular in this case. So we did the best we can as we were putting it together to not try to be too grisly about it. We're definitely not doing this to shock you guys. It's just there are elements of this case that are indeed shocking. This is a case that I like to call a crazed night. Aberdeen is a city in the Upper Hunter region of New South Wales, Australia. With a population of just 1,894 people, you wouldn't expect much from this small bush town, especially in the way of true crime. Although the area offers many different industrial sites, including nearby copper mines, Aberdeen was well known for the former slaughterhouses, or abattoirs, in the town center. It was at these same processing plants that Catherine Knight found her calling. From the age of 16, she had worked alongside her own family in the slaughterhouses, killing, skinning, and deboning carcasses. But in 1999, the abattoirs were too far out of date to offer safe working conditions to their workers. Companies moved their operations to the more updated sites in Queensland, leaving hundreds of people without work. This left Catherine with no way to provide for herself. Lucky for her, her boyfriend of 5 years, John Price, asked her to live with him and his 2 daughters. Although the couple's home life was full of fights and some physical abuse, everyone thought the two would eventually get married. But March 1st of 2000 put a stop to all of that. The day before, Price had warned his co-workers that his quarreling with Catherine had escalated and that if he didn't make it to work the next day, someone needed to call the police. When John didn't arrive at work as scheduled, his co-workers went to his house to check on the couple. As they neared the home, they could see a large blood stain on the front door. Fearing the worst, police were then called. What officers found looked like a scene from a horror movie. There were blood trails throughout the house that led to the lounge area. In that room, they found John Price's headless and skinless body lying on the floor next to a comatose Catherine Knight. Above them, hanging from a hook in the entryway, was Price's skin, completely intact. Knight, who had taken a very large dose of prescription pills, was not able to speak to officers as she was loaded into an ambulance. But the next horror these officers witnessed would top what they had witnessed so far. It was so terrible, one officer would eventually have a nervous breakdown. The dining room table was set for dinner, but 2 of the chairs had place cards with John's daughters' names written on them, along with a full plate of food. Their plates were loaded with potatoes, pumpkin, beets, zucchini, cabbage, squash, and gravy that had been cooked in a stew, along with copious chunks of meat. A 3rd plate was partially eaten and found dumped in the backyard. On the stove sat a pot full of vegetables with Price's head resting inside. As officers waited anxiously for Knight to recover enough to be able to fill them in on the details of that night, they looked into her past. Catherine Mary Knight was born on October 24, 1955, into a very dysfunctional family in Aberdeen. Her mother, Barbara, was married to Jack Ruffin, but after having 4 sons with him, started an affair with one of her husband's co-workers, a man named Ken Knight. Both families were well known in their small community, and the affair caused quite an uproar. Local backlash forced Barbara and Ken to leave Aberdeen and move to a town 4 hours away named Moree. Taking none of her children with her, she would go on to have 4 more children with Knight, including a pair of twin girls, Joy and Catherine. In 1959, when Knight was 4, Jack Ruffin died, and his 2 boys, who had been living with him, moved in with their mother Barbara and her new husband Ken. Catherine's life had been no cakewalk up to that point, and after the boys moved in, her life became fraught with abuse from members of her own family. The issues this caused would only grow worse after she started attending Muswellbrook High School. Knight quickly became a loner and a bully who assaulted at least one child with a weapon and injured a teacher as well. Even without the ability to read or write, when she was emotionally stable, Catherine was said to be a model student who earned awards for good behavior. By the age of 15, she decided that school was just not for her. She wanted to be an abattoir worker in Aberdeen slaughterhouses, just like many of her family before her. At 16, she was given the opportunity to work at her dream job. She was quickly promoted and given her own set of butcher's knives. At home, the knives were hung over her bed so that they would always be handy if I needed them, she said, a habit she continued everywhere that she lived. Catherine's love life would be fraught with violence, a lesson she knew well from her home life with her own family. She first married in 1974 to a man named David Kellett. Their courtship was full of booze and fights, and on their wedding day, Knight's mother is quoted as telling her new son-in-law, "You better watch this one, or she'll effing kill you. Stir her up the wrong way or do the wrong thing, and you're effed." Her words turned out to be very true. On their wedding night, David woke to Knight strangling him. Her explanation? Her new husband didn't perform as well as she expected him to. During their tumultuous 10-year marriage, the couple had 2 daughters, and David was attacked several times. During one fight, Knight hit him over the head with a frying pan and cracked his skull, putting David in the hospital. Tired of the constant fights and abuse, David would leave Knight for another woman. When she found out, a crazed Knight was seen running through town, shrieking while she was pushing her newborn baby violently in a stroller. In front of witnesses, she tossed the baby on the railroad tracks moments before the train was due, stole an axe from someone's yard, and began threatening a passerby with it. Luckily, quick action by an elderly gentleman who lived nearby saved the child, and police took Knight to a psychiatric hospital for evaluation. After staying only a few hours, she checked herself out. At no time were any charges of any kind pressed against her. She and David would see each other in an on-again, off-again basis until 1986, when she took their 2 daughters and finally divorced him. Knight then met an ex-race car driver named David Saunders. After their first year together, Knight had her 3rd child, but received no marriage proposal or even an offer to move in with him. As more time went by, Saunders' lack of commitment started to anger Knight. One night, during a quarrel, she took Saunders' puppy and cut its throat in front of him, saying that this is what would happen to him if he ever cheated on her. The fight that would eventually end their relationship left Saunders in the hospital for 3 days after Knight hit him in the head with an iron and then stabbed him in the chest with a pair of scissors. Saunders left Knight, choosing to file no charges against her. In 1990, Knight started to date another slaughterhouse worker named John Chillingworth, and she had her 4th child with him. But while dating Chillingworth, Knight met a mine worker named John Price. She would date him secretly until she left Chillingworth in 1994. Price had 2 children of his own that got along well with Knight. But by 2000, it had become clear to Catherine that her usual ploy of having a child with her partner to keep them by her side would no longer work. At 45 years old, it seems that she was no longer able to conceive. When Knight insisted that Price marry her, he said no, throwing Knight into a rage. To get her revenge, she got him fired from his job of 17 years and would pull out one of her old tricks. In February of that year, she would go on to stab Price in the chest with a pair of scissors. It was only a superficial wound, and John Price did actually take some action to help protect himself. He got a restraining order against her, but by the end of the month, he was in fear for his life, telling his coworkers to call the police if he didn't show up for work. Police believe that when Price came home from work, Knight had already been to his home. When she arrived, his children were there, so Knight sent them to a friend's to stay the night. When Price returned from work, he followed his usual routine of checking in with the neighbors, who told him where his children were staying. After Price fell asleep at 11 p.m., Knight entered his home, made herself dinner, watched TV, showered, and then went upstairs. She woke Price up, and the 2 proceeded to have sex before he fell back to sleep. After that, Knight took one of her prized butcher knives and stabbed the sleeping Price at least 37 times. He fought her and was even able to make it to the front door of the house, leaving his blood on the door that police and coworkers would find the next day. Investigators believe that because of blood loss, he stumbled at the front door and either fell back into the house or was possibly pulled back into the house. After he succumbed to his wounds, Knight started her macabre preparations and cooking of that final meal. She laid down next to Price's body and took an overdose of pills, ready to die. Initially, Knight's attorneys wanted to plead to a charge of manslaughter, but that was quickly rejected by the court. In March of 2001, she was arraigned on the charge of murder, to which she entered a plea of not guilty, and the court set her trial date for October. Even though Knight claimed to have dissociative amnesia due to the horror of that terrible night, court-appointed psychiatrists claimed that she had borderline personality disorder. Even with that diagnosis, doctors stated that they did not believe her disorder had anything to do with the murder. One stated, "The killing and dismemberment of Price was simply premeditated acts of revenge and perverted pleasure derived from her grossly violent fantasies. What she did on that night was part of her personality, her nature, herself. But it is not a feature of borderline personality disorder. It is not even slightly connected." As evidence of her premeditation, prosecutors pointed to an ATM withdrawal made the night of the murder. After killing Price, Knight drove into town and withdrew $1,000 from his bank account. But one other piece of evidence would all but prove the prosecution's case. 16 months before the murder, Knight told her daughter, "I told him if he took me back this time, it was to the death. And if I kill Pricey, I'll kill myself after it." She made a similar claim to her brother 5 months before the murder, but that version didn't include her own death as part of it. It seemed that she had a different plan. She told him, "I'm going to kill Pricey, and I'm going to get away with it. I'll get away with it because I'll make out I'm mad." As worries of finding potential jurors for the grisly trial became foremost on everyone's mind, Knight seemed to accept her fate and finally entered a guilty plea. No reason was given for her change of heart, and despite the admission of guilt, Knight still refused to accept responsibility for her actions. At her sentencing hearing, Knight's lawyers requested that she be excused to avoid hearing some of the disturbing facts, a request that the court denied. When forensic pathologist Dr. Timothy Lyons took the stand and described some of the actions she had done, Knight became hysterical and had to be sedated. On November 8, 2001, Justice Barry O'Keefe stated that the nature of the crime and Knight's lack of remorse would require a severe penalty. He then sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole and ordered her papers be marked "never to be released." This was the first time in Australian history that this type of punishment had been imposed on a woman. John Price's daughter, Rosemary Biddle, would say, "I don't know. For some reason, I just can't seem to hate her. I can't feel the hate. A lot of my friends have always said to me, that's a good thing. That's a lot of my dad inside me because that's how Dad was. He didn't hate anybody. He used to say to me, babe, just be happy. Just be happy. Just be happy." Case cracked. I'd like to give a big thank you to Wikipedia, allthat'sinteresting.com, the Daily Mail, the New York Daily Times, 7news.com Australia, the New Zealand Herald, Daily Telegraph Australia, Ranker.com, and of course, Christy Arnhart for researching and writing up today's episode. Also, Christy wanted me to tell you guys, be sure to check out Beyond the Darklands episode, Catherine Knight, Cannibal, Psychopath, Mother, and Wife. So what's going on with Catherine? She is currently imprisoned at the Silverwater Women's Correctional Center in New South Wales, where she will remain for the rest of her life. She's not allowed to even have a cellmate, but she does attend church service and sings in the women's choir. She also makes $70 a week assembling airline headsets and apparently loves to knit. I can't believe they let that woman have needles. In June of 2006, Catherine Knight appealed her life sentence, claiming that a penalty of life in prison without parole was too severe for the crimes committed. Justices quickly dismissed the appeal, stating the crime was, quote, appalling and almost beyond contemplation. Wow. I don't know about you guys, but this is someone that I'm thankful has a life sentence. I'm thankful will never be on the street again. I just don't know that you can rehabilitate someone that has this type of criminal history. It's also really unfortunate that we have all these instances of physical violence and no one really pressing charges there. Because if someone might have pressed charges at that point, maybe she would have been incarcerated. Maybe at that point, she could have figured out a different way of living, and maybe Mr. Price would still have his life. I don't know. We keep bumping into cases like this where it's like there's warning indicators, and for some reason, they're just not seen. There's no one that I think is watching the history of someone like this until you get into a case like this where all of a sudden someone's trying to solve a murder and they put all these pieces together and they look at this puzzle in their lap and say, oh my God, this is terrible. And maybe they're wondering too, how did we not catch this before? But that is the first woman to essentially get life in prison in Australia. And I just wanted to give a very big shout out to the many brain scratchers in Australia out there. Thank you guys so much for supporting the channel. Also, a big thank you to PayPal supporters, actually. Sorry, I got a little accent there for some reason. Angela Welch Sola and Penny Mantzeratos. Thank you so much for donating via PayPal. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do that at www.lordandarts.com. Take care, everyone. I'll be back here on Wednesday with a brand new Brain Scratch Searchlight. Hope you'll be there. It's going to be right here on the Lord and Arts channel.